Welcome to the Reconciled podcast, where we're confronting cultural lies with hope, discernment, and biblical truth. Today, we have with us a special guest, Bill Federer, who is a prolific author and speaker who speaks on some of the hardest and most controversial topics of our culture. And I found him on Frank Turek's podcast talking about the border, and I knew this was something that I really wanted to have someone who had a lot of knowledge on the show to talk to you guys about it, to talk about what does the Bible say about the border? What is the truth? We have so many voices and noises telling us what's compassionate and what's not. And this is affecting our country in a real way. And there's a lot of history behind this. So we're going to get into that today. And we're also going to talk about one of his books, Silence Equals Consent. So thank you so much, Bill, for being here with us today. If you don't mind, just start with a little bit about you, how you got into speaking and writing.
Right. Well, my first book came off the press in 1994. It's called America's God and Country Encyclopedia Quotations. It's got quotes alphabetically arranged from Abigail Adams to Booker T. Washington, and it sold 500,000 copies. And that opened the door for me to write more books. So I've written about 30 books over the last 30 years. Did some with my wife called Miracles in American History. It did one on George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington, another one on history of Islam, another one on Franklin Roosevelt, and then all the past presidents. It's called Prayers and Presidents. And anyway, it has become a passion. I tell people that history is not prophetic, but it is predictive. Past behavior is the best indicator of future performance. Human beings sort of fall into categories and act certain ways in certain situations. And the only variables over time are technological advancements and military advancements. But it's that same fallen nature of Cain, kill, and Abel. It's just magnified to a more global scale. And anyway, another quote I like is from Arthur Schlesinger Jr. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning historian on John F. Kennedy's staff. And the quote is, "History is to the nation what memory is to the individual." So have you ever met an individual who has lost their memory? Maybe they have Alzheimer's. It's sad. Well, we sort of have national Alzheimer's. Here we are, the freest country that planet Earth has ever seen in 6,000 years of human beings writing down human records. Writing was invented around 3300 BC, called Sumerian cuneiform, according to secular archaeologists. And so 6,000 years of records. It's all kings, Pharaoh, Caesar, it's top down. And if you're serving the king, you're more equal. You're on the end. If you're their enemy, you're dead. It's called treason. That's been the norm. America is this unique experiment based on ancient Israel, the first 400 years out of Egypt before they had a king. But America is where it's a bottom-up form of government, where it's we the people, and the politicians carry out our will versus us submitting to their will. And so we forgot how unique America is in world history. And as a result, we're letting our freedoms get taken away. A book I did on socialism, I go through how most people won't give away their freedom when everything's fine. It's usually in a crisis. And so you actually have decades and centuries of political philosophers writing about usurping power in times of crises and creating crises. And, you even have one of the 19th century military strategists in Germany, Karl von Clausewitz, and he gave the classic definition for the purpose of war: to get your enemy to submit to your will. All this fighting, battlefield strategy, weapons, but the goal is get your enemy to submit to your will. Well, what if you could get them to submit without a fight? And so that's where you have Sun Tzu's Art of War. Supreme excellence in a commander is to defeat your enemy without a fight. And so it's called psychological warfare. But now it's called the fifth generation warfare, where you get your enemy to surrender without them even being aware they're in a war. If the goal is to get them to submit, why even wake them up? Just come up with some ways. And so usually fear. So if you can get the population into fear, they'll willingly and voluntarily give up their freedoms to get past the fear. And so it's this whole well-developed strategy, especially during the Cold War, of creating crises to get people into fear so they'll surrender their freedom to the state. And now we're seeing it magnified on a global level.
It sounds familiar.
I sort of packed a lot into that little bit there, but it's become a passion to try to use history to study human behavior enough to be predictive.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it definitely sounds familiar. I would say that it seems like socialism and the border are some of the top things that I see Christians misunderstanding. Some of these other issues, like abortion or the transgender movement, are a little bit more clear to people, but for some reason, this doesn't seem quite as clear. But it seems like, based on what I've heard from you, that the Bible does talk and does speak to that. So I know it's hard to condense world history down to a few minutes, but if you're able to give us just a brief history on borders throughout history and how it has affected nations over time, either positively or negatively, and where did they come from? Were they God's idea? Were they man's idea? So if you could just start there for me.
Yeah, yeah. I do want to throw in that prior to what we're seeing today, the attitude was to send missionaries around the world and to educate populations and to help those countries become prosperous so that the people won't want to leave, to help them get educated, to help them. I mean, why leave if they're fine and everything's great where their family heritage and their history is? And you come back to this globalist perspective where they want to destabilize these other countries so that people will give up and move and come. It's part of a plan that globalists, you have Klaus Schwab, and he's got the World Economic Forum,
Mm-hmm.
and he said things like, uh, if we've learned anything in the last 500 years, it's that acute crises contribute to boosting the power of the state. And then you have people like George Soros, who says the United States is the main obstacle to a fair and just world. Okay, so you get these globalists wanting to get rid of the United States so they can have a fair and just world. What are they going to have? They're going to have global gangs, right? If America was removed, you just have global gangs. Russia, Iran, China, North Korea. It's going to be a gang fight, and human life will be crushed.
And people say that people make that seem like it's conspiratorial, but these people are openly saying these things and writing these things.
Yeah, Brock Chisholm was the first director of the World Health Organization. Many people are familiar with the World Health Organization. So the first director, Brock Chisholm, said to achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their national patriotism. And so, and then even George H.W. Bush, the first Iraq War, and he says this is terrible, but out of it will come a new world order. It's like, okay, that sounds a little bit strange for you to say that at this time. Borders. You go back to the Tower of Babel, and Josephus, the Jewish commentator, said Nimrod wanted to build a tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And so he was sort of defiant against God. And Nimrod made everybody in town bake bricks and bring them, or he would kill them. And so he wanted people to fear him and his government more than fear God. That was Nimrod's big contribution. Get people to fear the government instead of God. All began with Nimrod. And so God comes down, confuses the languages, and the people scatter into language groups that turn into nations. Lo and behold, nations were God's invention to postpone a one world government. But every generation, you have some Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar that wants to what? Conquer other nations and destroy borders and rule it all. Basically, every generation has somebody wanting to rebuild the Tower of Babel. And so nations, they were God's invention. And you had the acknowledgement of Abraham, and he traveled from Ur the Chaldeans to what is today Syria, and then came down into what is today the Holy Land. And you had kings with cities, and they controlled their city and controlled the area around their city, but they didn't have defined borders except maybe a river or a mountain range. But then you had the children of Israel coming back out of Egypt into the promised land. And you have two things. One, God telling Moses the borders of what's going to be Israel. And it goes from the Mediterranean Sea over to what is today Syria and Iraq, and then down to Egypt and Arabia. But he gives them borders. And fast forward, you have one king, David, that actually has Israel expand to control everything within those borders. And David is being tempted to be an Alexander the Great. You say, what do you mean? He takes a census. Now, he's already expanded Israel to the full borders God had promised, and he takes a census. Kings take censuses before they go to war so they can know how many soldiers they have. And even Jesus gives the parable. One king going to war with, 20,000 is going to face another king with, 10,000, and he decides whether or not he can win. And so if he doesn't think so, he can sue for peace. But what are they doing? They're taking censuses so they know how many soldiers they have. And then Joab, the general, was upset and said, David tells him to take it anyway. And then afterwards, matter of fact, Joab refused to count the Israelites. I mean, the Levites, because they were the priests and they were scattered throughout the land and they were sort of extra special. And he's like, okay, I'm not going to violate this against the priests and count them. And so after David takes this census, it says that his conscience bothered him, that the Lord convicted him that he had sinned, that he was trusting in his power rather than trusting in the Lord. He was wanting to expand past the borders God promised. And then the prophet says, okay, you got your choice of punishments. 3 years of running from your enemies and 3 months of famine and whatever. And David throws himself on the mercy of the Lord, and they have a famine. And then he sees an angel poised over Jerusalem with a sword, and the threshing floor of Arna. I'm not pronouncing that correctly, I know. But David goes there and buys the threshing floor, and that's the spot where they build the temple. So you have borders for Israel. And then when they're coming out of Egypt into the promised land, God tells Moses, don't cross the border into Edom. Edom means red, but it's referring to Esau, because he was born and he had, I guess he had red hair on him. But it was the land of Esau. So you have Jacob, which his name was changed to Israel, and then all of his children. But then you have Esau, and then his children are called Edomites. And God is saying, okay, go into the promised land, but don't cross the border into the land of the Edomites. That's not yours. I'm not giving it to you. So here's God saying there's borders, and saying respect the borders and don't cross the borders. And then Moses, he's on the mount. I think it was Horeb. I'm not quite sure of, or Pisgah maybe, but he's looking into the promised land. And God says, you can see it, but you're not going to cross the border into the promised land because you sinned at the waters of Meribah. And what's the waters of Meribah? That's where God told Moses, speak to the rock and water will come out. But instead he takes his rod and he smites the rock twice. So God said, okay, you dishonored me in front of the people and you're not going to go into the promised land. And Moses begs him, and God says, don't talk to me again about it. You're not going. But here's God saying there's borders. And then Joshua, right? He sends the different spies in, and they come back, and then they cast lots, and they decide which tribe gets which area with which borders. And, some goes from the Great Sea over to the Jordan River, and some goes here and some goes there. But we're talking borders, and we're talking inside of Israel, but there's still borders between the tribes, and they're supposed to respect them. But you have, over the years, you always have some king wanting to conquer other lands. You had the Assyrians in 722 BC captures northern Israel and takes the 10 tribes, they call the 10 lost tribes, but he scatters them throughout the world. And then in the 6th century BC, you have Babylon taking Israel captive, and for 70 years. And then Cyrus lets the Jews go back and rebuild. And Cyrus talks about 127 provinces within the control of Cyrus of Persia. And the Jews go back. And then there's Alexander the Great. He conquers Persia. He's got a military advantage of phalanx spears. These big, long spears that are at least a dozen feet long, maybe longer than that. And the soldiers would march with them pointed up in the air. And then at an order, they would all put them forward. And then if they were being attacked from the side, they would give an order, and they'd all put their spears up in the air, and they would all turn to the right. And then they would give the order to lower them down. And so the enemy couldn't even get close enough to fight them, because these spears were, 20 feet long. And then, the guys standing behind the guys, you'd have an 18-foot long. And then, so Alexander the Great conquers Persia, and then he has 4 generals, and they divide it into 4 areas. Each of those have borders. And the Seleucus general takes Persia. Another Ptolemy general takes Egypt. and then another takes Macedonia, and then another Greece, but they're borders.
Right.
And then you have the Seleucus descendant kings want to wipe out the religion in Israel, and the Jews 165 BC fight back. They win, and they chase the Syrians out, and it's called Feast of Hanukkah. Right? They pour the oil in the lamp and they clean out the temple, but it's only supposed to last for a day, but it lasts 8 days. And then after that, the Jews are their own nation for a century, the Hasmonean kingdom, and so they have borders. But then on the inside, you have the Sadducees fighting the Pharisees. So Pharisee means student of the law. They come back out of Babylon. You have the Ezra. He's a priest. He's teaching the law. And so out of all the planet, the Pharisees are studying God and worshiping him the closest to the way God wants to be worshiped. But then you have, when Alexander the Great conquers, Greeks. And the Greeks come in, and they don't believe the Jewish faith, but they're the political power. And so you have some Jews that want to kiss up to the Greeks, and they're called Sadducees. And they consider the Jewish faith an embarrassment. Yeah, they believe these superstitious things like angels and resurrection and prophecies. And the Sadducees are secular Jews that have basically want to butter up to the Greek overlords. But once the Greeks are kicked out, right? Seleucus descendants, kings, it turns into a civil war inside of Judea between the Sadducees and Pharisees. And meanwhile, you have Pompey, the Roman general. He's up by the Black Sea, Cappadocia, Armenia, and he's conquering. And word comes to him, there's a civil war in Judea. And Pompey says, perfect time to come in. And he crosses the border. And the Pharisees side with Pompey against the Sadducees, who control the Temple Mount. And Pompey wins. And the Pharisees are happy. But the Romans decide to make Judea a Roman province. And so from that time on, they begin to take more and more control. Herod the Great's dad helped Julius Caesar in a battle. And then after the battle, Caesar's like, thanks a bunch. Can I do anything to help you? And Herod the Great's dad says, hey, I'd like to be the governor of Judea. And Caesar said, done. And so you have this Edomite guy, all right, Herod the Great's dad. He gets circumcised, so they consider him a Jew. But he's now ruling, and then Herod the Great's the one who builds Caesarea, named after Caesar, and he builds the temple, but he also builds another temple to Apollo, and he restarts the Olympics, which had been canceled when the Romans conquered Greece. But there's still borders. And then finally, fast forward to 135 AD, and you have Hadrian, and he is upset that these Jews keep rebelling, and he sends over a legion. Well, the Jews wipe out the legion. Over 6,000 soldiers gone. He sends over another legion. It's ambushed, and it disappears from history. And then Hadrian decides to send over every Roman legion to wipe out Judea. And they go city by city, tearing it down, wiping out, killing like a million Jews, and then changes the name on the map from Judea to Syria, Palestina. So whenever we see, Palestine, where that name came, it came from Hadrian, 135 AD. What do you want? He wanted to wipe out the borders of Judea.
Which is interesting how that's circled back to our conversations today.
Yeah. So
with Palestine, I've talked about that on my show. I've covered some of the history of what Palestine is with this current, we've got a lot of people saying to stand with Palestine and these things like that. And so I covered some of the history just very briefly on my show, what I could, but it was interesting to learn the kind of where that name came from. But So it seems like there's a lot of, I think a lot of people would agree, maybe we shouldn't infringe on other countries' borders and take it into our own hands like that. Do you have any scenarios that you can look back to in history and specifically Rome? I think I've heard you talk about this, where it wasn't necessarily kings crossing over and causing issues, but maybe more like our situation today, where we have these, maybe what you would call civilians, or some of them are claiming asylum, coming over into the country. Do we see anything like that in history causing problems for nations as well?
Yeah, so when a nation gets weak, their borders are undefended. So
Mm.
when you look at the globe, the Chinese begin to build the Great Wall of China. They build it in sections, but they make a big move to build it around the second century AD. So the Huns, which were like a Mongolian type people, and they rode on horses, the Huns would attack into China. But once the Great Wall was being built, the Huns turned westward and began to attack a neighboring tribe, which is displaced and moves further west and attacks a neighboring tribe, which is displaced and moves further west and attacks another neighbor. And it starts a domino effect of displaced tribes across Central Asia that begin to spill across the Roman borders into Europe. They first came slow and assimilated. The Visigoths and then the Ostrogoths and then Rome went from a republic, SPQR, Senatus Publicus Romanus, and they conquered. And then Julius Caesar flipped it into an empire, but then Constantine made it into a Christian empire. But as Rome became more prosperous, the women waited longer to have children and had fewer of them. But these immigrants coming in, right, they started having children sooner and had more of them. And so Will and Ariel Durant, who wrote a multi-volume history of the world, saw this trend. And they said, as civilizations advance and become more prosperous, they have fewer children. And the less developed countries have more children. He says, in this way, fate seems to punish the civilized nations by bringing in those that have more. So it's just a matter of time until
That's
the
crazy.
uncivilized
That's
conquer the
what we're
civilized.
living in right now, isn't it? And you think feminism's new. It seems like nothing's new under the sun.
Yeah, even Julius Caesar, when this trend was beginning, began to ban women from riding in. It's like a carriage without wheels. You got the four servants and they would carry the chair, right? But he forbade the women from riding in those things unless they had children. And then there was a certain style of dress that was stylish in Rome, and he forbade women from wearing that style unless they had children. He realized that they were being taken over. And the Visigoths, again, they first came in and they did all the menial jobs, the servants and the cleaning, and the Romans loved them. Matter of fact, some Romans that didn't have children would adopt their Visigoth servant as their own child. And then they would leave them an inheritance. And then some of the Visigoths got into the military and they served courageously in the military. But then they were given a task to guard the borders and keep out their Visigoth relatives. And it's like, okay, how's this going to work? And then some of them would defect and go over, and they would take with him all the Roman fighting knowledge. So now they would know the weapons and the strategies and how to do this. And there was a particular winter where the Rhine River froze and a bunch of Visigoths crossed the river and nobody chased them out the next spring. And then more came across and more came across. And then they kept their own languages and they did not assimilate. And you'd have these pockets of other people groups inside of the Roman Europe. And then you had other groups coming across, the Germanic tribes who worship Thor. That's where you get the word Thor's Day, right? Thor lived in a oak tree in Geismar, Germany, and Saint Boniface came from Britain in 722 A.D. and with an axe and chopped down Thor's tree, and that's when the Germans converted to Christianity. And Saint Boniface pointed at an evergreen tree and said, "Let this be the tree of the Christ child." And it points toward heaven. Its leaves are evergreen. It's in the shape of a triangle, like the Trinity, and sort of the same way that Patrick used a three-leaf clover to teach these illiterate Druid pagans about Christianity and converted all of Ireland. Anyway, then the Franks came across. Now, these were nomadic people groups, but once they went into Europe, and then the Franks, went up to the oceans, like you can't migrate anymore, so they began to stay. And then they began to, have a border disputes with the German tribes. But then, for a while you had Charlemagne, 800 AD, and his grandfather was Charles Martel that stopped the Muslims who had conquered Spain and then had conquered southern France. And Charles Martel stopped him and was grandson Charlemagne. But then you have other people groups coming into Europe, and they were nomadic, but then they began to settle. The Huns settled into what is called Hungary. And then St. Stephen in 1000, he was their king and he converted to Christianity. The Russian people groups were not unified until the Swedes came down. And the Swedes rowed boats, and the Russian word for rower is Rus, R-U-S. So they think that the very name Russian comes from Rus, which is their word for the Swedes who rowed in. And so for several centuries, Sweden and Russia were sort of ruled the same. But anyway, you begin to see the borders in Europe take shape, and they were physical borders, but there were also language groups that were there, and you had kings. But you would have different kings. There's always an outside inside that goes back and forth. People wanted to be independent, but then when they were attacked from the outside, they would say, okay, look, we need to work together. And so when France was being attacked, they would have different kings that would actually tear down castle walls to force them to unify as a nation of France. But then Otto von Bismarck did the same thing. Germany was a bunch of kingdoms, Saxony, Bavaria, Prussia. And he, in the late 1800s, unified Germany. And, same thing happened in China. You would have the warring states period around the, 3rd century BC. But then one wins, Qin Shi Huangdi, and he begins to unify China. But what does he do? He tears down the walls around these different kingdoms. And they're like, well, but we're being attacked by the Huns. He goes, okay, tell you what, I'll just build the Great Wall. And that'll save you from the Mongols and the Huns. But I'm going to not have walls inside. And, as the centuries go on, you have maritime empires with the Portuguese and Spanish, and then the English and the French and the Dutch. And so now you're having different type of walls. It's basically defended by military navies. And then, but if you plot on a graph, you can see that the areas where these kings can control keeps getting bigger, because whoever gets the latest military advancements first gets a window in time to conquer other nations. You have a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, and he goes through how come Western civilization has a leg up on the other countries around the world. And he says how in Mesopotamia, they had domesticable grains like barley and wheat, and domesticable animals like cattle and chicken. And that allowed them to become agricultural based. Whereas the rest of the areas, they were still what they called hunter-gatherers. And you would kill it the day, you'd eat it the night, but you didn't have anything saved up because you hadn't developed agriculture. The rest of the world, you had fruit in Africa and gazelles that run 60 miles an hour. How are you going to domesticate that? They couldn't, zebras are too ornery. India, you had, maybe water buffalo and elephants, but you really couldn't domesticate them, like to pull a plow. And China had pigs and, and stuff, and rice. But Mesopotamia had this also. They were able to become agricultural first. And then once that happens, two things: depletes the soil, so you got to expand to get more agricultural land. But you've also developed tools for farming that turn into tools for weapons. And so you would see, again, this expansionistic thing. Anybody that can plot on a graph sees that at some point it's going to max out on a global level. Right. And Jesus said, wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. So borders in Rome were being overrun, and then Rome finally fell. So it's like a dam that keeps the river water out, but then if the dam starts to leak, you have little drips through the dam, but then finally it weakens, and then guess what happens? The dam breaks and push, it comes in. So you have these other countries coming into the poor countries wanting to come into the prosperous countries. It's like a weather pattern, right? Low pressure wants to, rush to the high pressure, or vice versa. There wants to be an equalization. And so they want to come in, and it first comes slow, and then it comes fast, and then it comes with armies, and then it gets violent. So when you begin to see a lot of, people crossing the borders, the next thing that happens is you're going to see armed groups crossing the borders, and then you're going to see outright invasion. And then the next step is the nation collapses, and there's an equalization, right? That there's no more difference in water pressure or air pressure, because it's all equalized, because the nation's walls were conquered and the flood of immigrants came in. So for the country that's being invaded, it's a step in a process of being losing its, and so they actually the globalists called this the trilateral. They started a group, decades ago after World War II, called the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. It's like, what's the lateral? So tri was Asia, America, and Europe, and lateral means equal. So America became this pile of cash, and they said, okay, let's buy up property in these other countries, and then we'll weaken America and have investments in these other countries, but they'll become more prosperous, but we're going to benefit off it. It's like if they're going to build a highway through an area, and you can buy up the land ahead of time, and then you can buy politicians and say, hey, make the highway go across my land, and then the price of your land goes up, you made a lot of money.
Right.
So that's what these globalists have been wanting to do. And so they divided the world into 10 groups, and so they want to get rid of the borders between Canada and Mexico, and have, this hemisphere be like one of these groups, but they do this. And so they want to be globalists. They want to control the world. And there's a lot there that, anybody that does a little research can find, because they've been writing on this for a century.
And I was going to ask about that, two things on that. So can you speak just a little bit about what is it about immigrants coming in, nomadic, maybe before they become, potentially violent or armed? What is it about that when they don't assimilate that weakens a country? And you touched on it just a little bit about what might motivate these politicians to advocate for these policies that allow this, because they probably know the history, and it seems like they would have to know what they're doing. Can you speak just a little bit about that? So why does the non-assimilation specifically weaken our country? And then what is it that these politicians are getting out of allowing all these illegal immigrants into our nation?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting when you go back to Daniel, the prophet, and Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he interprets the dream and says, okay, there's this statue with a head of gold, arms and chest of silver, abdomen of bronze, and then the legs of iron, and then the feet of iron and clay. And so he says, thou, Nebuchadnezzar, are this head of gold. You're the top kingdom. You're the wealthiest. But after he's going to come the Medo-Persian Empire. They're weaker. They're silver, but they'll be stronger. And then after that's going to come the abdomen of bronze, which is the Greeks, and they had bronze swords, and they conquered the Persian Empire. But then after the Greeks come the Romans, and they had iron swords, and they conquered, and they broke into the East and the West, but it was still, Roman. So that's where they think, you have Eastern Europe and Western, and that somehow, America fits into the Western, right? Because we were sort of started out of Britain. But then the feet are what? They're iron and clay, and iron and clay don't mix. And so it's part strong and part weak. And so people that study prophecy think, hey, I wonder if a lot of these Islamic immigrants coming into this Judeo-Christian West, and they're not assimilating. And it's breaking up the unity and the power of these Western countries. So I'm not a prophecy expert, but that is something that's there. When you look at America in particular, we are a country of immigrants. And originally, every immigrant was a net plus. Why? Because there's no welfare programs yet. The welfare programs was your relatives and the church.
Right.
And so people would come to America, and they'd show up at the port. Well, what do I do? Oh, Uncle Joe. And so you would live with Uncle Joe until you got your feet on the ground. And then churches. So prior to the welfare state, the church did all of that social welfare stuff. So the immigrants would come across, and they were not a burden on society, because they weren't costing the government anything. It was the churches and the family members that took care of them. And then the other is there was no minimum wage. So you could, if you wanted to start a business, you would go down to the dock, and you would come up to some immigrants and say, I'll give you a job. And they'd pack together and live in an apartment together, and they would work the job. And what would happen? They would learn the language, and then they would learn a skill. Most of them came from agricultural countries, and they didn't know many manufacturing, but they would learn a manufacturing skill or something. Well, guess what? The next generation, they would own a little shop or a little factory or a little business, and then they would be the ones to go down to the dock and hire some other different immigrants. And there was no minimum wage, and they would work for dirt cheap, but they would live in the same apartment. They'd pool their money, and then the next generation would own the shops and businesses. And so you would have waves of immigrants. The first big wave was Scotch Irish. So Ireland was Catholic, and then beginning with King James and Elizabeth, they transplanted a bunch of Scottish people who were Protestant into Northern Ireland. But then there was a financial collapse and famine, and so about 200,000 of them flooded into America. And so most of the early founding fathers had Scotch Irish. And then you had Germans. And Germany was not Germany. It was a bunch of kingdoms and a lot of wars, religious wars. And so you'd have a lot of Germans coming across. And then you would have a lot of the Italians, and then Polish, and then Eastern Europeans, and then Jews. But each wave would go down to the dock and hire somebody who would work for dirt cheap. And so it would help everybody. But then when you get minimum wage, it would be like, okay, I have to pay my workers a certain amount. And guess what? This person coming across, they don't know the language. They're not going to make enough money for a long time to pay for themselves. So I'm not going to hire them. And so now you have a bunch of these immigrants just sort of hanging around the docks. And so the government comes along and says, we'll give you welfare, right? The churches are the ones that originally did the welfare, but then under FDR, you have these big government programs. And then something happened. They found out that if people receive free money, they'll vote for the candidates that promise to continue to give free money.
Makes sense.
And so it's a human phenomenon. I mean, if you were getting a $1,000 check in the mail every week from someone you didn't know, week after week, $1,000, like clockwork, $1,000. After a few years of that, would you ask yourself, who is sending me this $1,000 check every week? I'm going to find out who they are and vote them out of office. Would anybody do that? I mean,
No.
I'd be like, my kid's got a few more bills to pay, before I vote them out. It's like, once you get people to receive free money, you can count on their vote.
Right.
And so once the welfare program got put into place, especially with LBJ and his Great Society welfare state, there was a political motivation to bring in people who would not work jobs, but would sign up for welfare. And then they would register them to vote, and they would become Democrat voters, and they would keep in power certain politicians.
Yeah.
And so it was LBJ and Teddy Kennedy that pushed through in 1965 the change in the immigration quotas. European immigrants, Christian immigrants from Western influenced countries had what's called a work ethic. And it was considered a social stigma and embarrassment to be on welfare.
Right.
You'd see other people and, what do you do for a living? What do you do for a living? What do you do? And they'd be like, I just receive a welfare check. It would be an embarrassment. So the what's called the Christian work ethic, those people, when they would come across, they would refuse to receive welfare for that reason. And then a lot of the blacks after the Civil War, who had, Booker T. Washington. And he said, I don't want you to get a job. I want you to create jobs. I said, I want you to own property. He said, I want you to be the one lending the money, not borrowing. And he said that we have to become, so he started the Negro Chamber of Commerce 10 years before the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was started. It's called the Negro Business League. But it was this understanding that we have to become prosperous. And then there were like George Washington Carver. And he said, I never allowed anyone to give me money. No difference how badly I needed it. I wanted literally to earn my own living. There was this pride in being able to say that you are self-supportive.
Right.
And so the people that had this Christian work ethic refused the welfare. And they would end up voting for candidates that would take away as little as possible from their hard-earned wealth. It's like, I worked really hard for this. My family worked hard. We saved it up. I don't want somebody taxing it and taking it away. I'm going to vote for the ones that want a smaller government. Well, guess what? When the Great Depression happened and FDR comes along and says, hey, you're out of work, we'll give you a government paying out job with all these alphabet programs, and you'll bill stuff, but you'll be getting it. And then, it started backdoor after the Civil War, Lincoln supporting widows. Okay, we took their sons to fight in the war and died. Okay, we got to support this widow. And then it was supporting maimed soldiers. Okay, they're back from the war. They lost a leg or an arm. Okay, well, and then it became to them, and then putting their families on welfare. And then it went from that to having immigrants come across and immediately signing them up for welfare, and then them immediately having a motivation to keep in power those that are giving them the free money.
Right.
And I
Seems like
personally,
there's always this message that is such a one-sided message spoken, mostly from the progressive left, is the empathy kind of shaming that they do, where they show you this picture of an immigrant or these people that look desperate and they're here and they need help, and it's just always the message of the one side, but never actually what policies cause and the effect that it has on our nation and our people. And they don't really highlight the stories at the border of the over 300,000 children that are missing, that are potentially and being sex trafficked. They don't bother mentioning any of those things, and they call conservatives or people that are pro border, pro nation, sovereign nation, hateful and bigoted, and that's unloving, and that's not what God would do. So what would you say to someone that argues from that standpoint of empathy for one side, for the one immigrant, versus what reality actually is, and why is it loving to have borders, not just for us but for other countries?
we have to go back to the source of the problem. Why do they want to leave their country in the first place? So during the Cold War, you had the KGB and the CIA, and they're starting wars. Literally, they're going into countries, starting wars to overthrow the leaders. They would call it critical theory. You go into a country, study the groups, economic groups, racial groups, religious groups, and you would call some victims and others oppressors, haves and have-nots, and then you would stir them up to protest and riot and fight each other. And then when there's bloodshed in the street, everybody's willing to surrender their freedom to some leader that promises to restore order. And when the dust settles, they've transitioned to a Soviet puppet, or in the CIA's case, something was pro-American. But people were leaving these other countries because of these wars. Well, I mean, there's I got quotes, from Greek Orthodox and Armenian Orthodox and Chaldean Orthodox Christian priests and ministers. And they're like, why is the United States arming terrorists in Syria? I mean, like, for decades, we've been arming terrorists. There was even a Los Angeles Times article, and it says, terrorist groups over in Syria armed by the CIA are fighting terrorist groups armed by the Pentagon. So Tulsi Gabbard introduces a bill, Stop Arming Terrorists Act. Right, got Ron Paul to and a lot of them. So we first have to address our own government starting wars, displacing people that causes them to want to leave in the first place. That's one thing. And the second is globalists. So you go back, I remember being in the 1990s, you had GATT and NAFTA. What were those? So you had businesses that would do business with other countries, and they would say, let's give Mexican businesses a favorable status to trade. And the globalists said, okay, this is great. And it allowed these big globalist corporations to go into Mexico and to set up these farming operations with their big combines and their big machinery. And they would produce corn so cheap that it put out of business all the subsistence farmers. And so you would have these little farmers with their little, backyards and their little, chickens and cows and their little field, and they would grow corn, and then they would go with their corn to their little market and they would sell it and they'd make tortillas. Well, guess what? Now these globalist multinational corporations come in and they can produce completely made tortillas cheaper than what this guy can harvest his own corn with. And so it puts out of business entire towns. And it's like, where do we do? And so since GATT and NAFTA were put in place, there were 50 more Mexican billionaires. So the big elites are getting money, but all these poor people are losing money. So what do? They have to support their family. And so they would hear and they would move and migrate. And then you have people like, George Soros and these other groups that actually fund with NGOs moving these people into America to have them become voters. And then you have them working together with Catholic charities, Lutheran charities, United Way, these other groups that will take these immigrants and bring them into cities without the city knowing about it, and then signing them up for all the welfare programs, and then leaving town saying, it's your problem now. And so you have these little bitty towns, and all of a sudden they have hundreds and thousands of people that don't speak their language on welfare, wandering around downtowns. The crime goes up, the property value goes down, girls are getting raped. And it's like, who's doing this? Well, the Catholic Charities. And if they did it, we're just giving a cup of cold water to the poor. It's like, at least tell the people in the town that you're bringing them into that you're doing it. Maybe ask them their permission. Maybe ask them if they want this to happen. Maybe have a little bit of a throttle so you can turn it on and turn it off.
Yeah.
Will and Ariel Durant, I mentioned them. They said that if Rome could have, from time to time, slowed down the immigration of the people into the Roman Empire, if they could have funneled them through their schools rather than through their slums, then maybe Rome could have continued adding into the Roman culture the new vitality of these different people groups, and Rome could have survived.
Mm.
And so the thought is, how much food do you eat in a year? What if I were to sit you down and make you eat it all in a day? You would die. You only eat food as fast as your body can assimilate it. Well, you have the body politic, right? The nation. You need immigrants. You need people to come in. You need new life and new vitality. And you want to give people who are persecuted in other countries, with freedom and so forth. But you only bring them in as fast as you can assimilate it.
Right.
Right? They learn the language, they learn the skill, they learn to be a part. If you bring them in too fast, they don't assimilate, and it breaks up the unity. It's the way Christian schools, so Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they all started as Christian schools. They were schools to train ministers and to train missionaries. But over time, you would have parents saying, look, my kid's not Christian, but if I put him into a Christian school, maybe they'll get Christian. And so it's like, okay, we'll take a certain percentage of kids that are not Christian, but they'll come in. Well, guess what? If you take too big of a percentage of non-believing kids, they're going to pressure and bully the believing ones. And then they're going to be pressured to maybe adopt behavior and dress and everything and then before you know it, those schools are secular.
Yeah.
Well, they might still have some professors, but then the professors end up, becoming less lax, and then they begin adopting, all kinds of different sexual behavior that's absolutely contrary to the founders of the university. And so that's where you see all these colleges that were started with Christians donating money to build this thing so that they could have more Bible teachers and have their denomination grow. And instead they end up becoming something where they're pushing something totally opposite of what the founders intended.
Right. Well, I think they can build some kind of utopia, and that's the problem with what we know as Christians, is that this world is really always tending towards disorder and chaos, and there is a spiritual battle going on. But something else I was going to say was, so when you were talking about how they come in and too fast and they can't assimilate, they really can't assimilate because there's not the infrastructure. Like, you come in, you drop thousands of people in this tiny town, and there's not enough housing, and then that drives the housing prices up and all these things. But the thing that I was accused by someone after one of my episodes where I spoke about the town in Ohio, I think it's Springfield, where recently there was the controversy with the Haitian immigrants there. And I was accused of calling every illegal immigrant a criminal. And of course, I've never said that, and I don't claim that, and I don't believe that, although they have already committed a crime by crossing the border illegally. But the issue that I was trying to point out is that I actually am not really angry at them. I believe that weight of responsibility falls on the politicians who brought them in, put them on welfare, dropped them in this town where they truly can't assimilate. And then what's going to happen when they can't go get a job? They don't know the language. They don't know our laws. They're going to end up breaking those laws and becoming criminals after that. So it was just it's like we can't take a step back and see the full picture of how this all works together. It's just, oh, this sounds good in theory, and so therefore we're going to do it, and we don't really care how it turns out.
Yeah. So the first thing is other countries. Why don't we go back to sending missionaries to other countries and helping them become successful? A study was done, Robert Woodbury, Baylor University, of countries that what he called Protestant conversionary missionaries went to in the 1800s, compared to countries where other missionaries went of more of a hierarchical denomination structure. And he found that those countries today are more prosperous with more freedom where Protestant conversionary missionaries went to. It's statistically repeatable studies. It's fact. So when the Protestants would go in, they would do what? Teach people to read so they could read the Bible. And it would produce a literate population. And then they would read the Bible and they would see that the one servant multiplied his talents from 5 to 10, another from 2 to 4. And then the wicked person buried the talent. So what does that mean? That means you want to do something with your life. And then it talks about charity. You want to give away. So you have to have something that which you can give away. And so when the children of Israel went into the promised land, every family was given property. If you own property, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible call that being blessed. And then you can give away some of your stuff. The Bible call that charity. And so this idea is, so the countries where a hierarchical denomination would go in, they would educate the elites. And so they would keep the pyramid power structure in place. So instead of the illiterate people going to a pagan temple, they would still be illiterate. They would just go to a cathedral. And the power families would still be the power families. Now, the hierarchical church structure saw itself as being a conscience to the king. And so they would remind these elites that you're going to be accountable to the judge of all. So that was good, but it didn't bring about a societal change. And so you compare Mexico with America. America has a predominantly Protestant background, and Mexico is predominantly Catholic. And so the people in Mexico, when they finally had their revolution in 1824, they had not been trained in a lot of these self-government tactics, and then it turned into just one revolution after another, after another, after another. And they're like, why is America different? You go to the border, same air, same land, even the same people, DNA. It's this idea of one has a self-government teaching hard work and what you're accountable to God for your actions, and the other's more of a hierarchical, and I need somebody to tell me what to do. Right. And so that's a phenomenon. So why don't we go back to going into these countries and helping them to become successful? That way they can not only keep their identity and keep their language, and they can keep their land. They can keep their family heritage. They can keep their family, right? They can keep their church, their culture. It's like, let them keep their culture and keep their land. Wouldn't that be a good thing? And have them be successful. So that's one answer. Another point is, again, it used to be that the church did the welfare, not the government. And so in the Bible, God gives commands. So it's not the government's job to take care of the poor. In the Bible, God gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. Individuals are commanded to take care of the poor, right? Family commands are mostly relational. Husbands, love your wives, children, obey your parents. Business commands are do an honest day's work and don't hold back wages. The church is commanded to take care of the poor, and historically they did. And they're the ones that did all the social programs: soup kitchens, hospitals, nursing homes, visiting the poor, the shut-ins, the maimed, right? There's no command for the government to take care of the poor. The command to the government's the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in healthcare. That's why churches started all the hospitals almost, right? There's no command for the government to be involved in education. The government's job was just to have everybody be treated equally under the law and to maintain order in a society. So we need to get back to the government withdrawing from these things. Under Obama, I was with a pastor in Las Vegas, and he said how their church had been involved in going to restaurants and collecting their old bread and their food, and then having benevolence ministries where they give away to the poor. And Obama came in and went to these businesses and says, don't give it to the churches, give it to us. We'll set up a feeding center and we'll give you tax credit for giving it to us. And then the government will have somebody in the churches. And so then when a poor person comes to the church, all the church has to do is say, oh, go see that person. And that person brings them in and gives them the stuff. And guess what? Registers them to be Democrat voters. And this pastor said when it first started, and they still agreed, if the church wanted to keep their program going, they could buy the food from the government benevolence center. and rather than just collecting free donations. But it was, again, the government encroaching on traditionally what was the church's role in education and in healthcare and in taking care of the poor. But then there's the last part, and that's crime. So you have a political motivation to increase crime. People say, what? So yeah. So if you bring in people that don't follow the laws, and you put in judges that let the criminals get back on the street, right? And then you teach that you want to let the victim, oh, you don't understand the victim. They did this crime because they had a bad upbringing. And so you're letting crime increase. Why is that political? When crime increases in a big city, some people don't feel safe and they move out. Who? Well, maybe people with children, right? Pro-family people move out. Well, pro-family people, they're usually a lot of Republicans. That's like a big Republican issue, pro-family. And then who else moves out? Well, small business people. I mean, how can you go shopping in an area where there's crime? I mean, the ladies are getting raped in the parking lots, right? You don't want to, so small business people move out. And so pro-business people, they're a higher percentage Republican. Who's left in the city? More people on welfare. And well, guess what? They're a higher percentage Democrat. And in election years, whoever wins the big city ends up winning the state. Whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president's elected by electoral votes. They literally have a political strategy that goes back to increasing crime in the city on purpose so that pro-family people, pro-business people move out, and more people are all right. They're mostly Republican. And then who's left? More people are dependent on government benefits, then more Democrat. And then they get that monopoly. They get to count the votes. They usually wait until all the other areas have voted. And then on election day, they'll slip in. It just tips it like Chicago. Right? That's why they don't want to clean up the voter rolls. If the people that move out of town, guess what? Their names stay on the voter rolls.
Yeah.
And when there's efforts to purge the voter rolls, they call it discriminatory. But when let's say there's an election and there's a 50% voter turnout, and maybe the Republicans win. Well, if the city still has twice as many names on the voter roll, they can do voter fraud and nobody notices. They just say it was a big voter turnout. And people say, oh, they don't do that. Yes, they do. Just do a little digging. I ran for Congress 3 times. I personally experienced people calling in our office saying that my name was accidentally left off the ballot in 5 wards in the city of St. Louis, right? And we were ahead. The electricity goes off in the Jefferson County Board of Election in Hillsborough, Missouri. And when they reboot, we go from ahead to behind. And then at our watch party, we get a phone call that they've lost boxes of ballots. And one of them was Guffey Elementary School, which was the biggest precinct that I personally stood in front of for 8 hours in the cold, shaking hand, and they lost the box of ballots, right? Voter fraud does
It's funny
happen.
how that works.
And what happened in the last election is there was such an overwhelming turnout that it blew out of the water all of their voter fraud efforts.
Yeah.
And so, but
yeah,
they still...
I was going to... Go ahead, sorry.
They still recounted, like in California, recounting ballots a month after the election. They kept recounting until the Democrat won.
Wow. It's almost like God, knew that government interference wasn't ever going to produce anything good. It seems like story after story, you can just hear it over and over again. The more they interfere, the more that we try to subsidize what the church was called to do or what we're called to do individually to the government, it creates disorder and chaos, which recently I read through Revelation, probably for the first time as an adult, where I really paid attention. And I've been paying attention to politics now for several years. And I realized that globalism is a demonic agenda. I mean, it's in Revelation right there that is the plan of the Antichrist, so I just found that really interesting. But do you feel like, based on this election, like you were just saying, the overwhelming turnout, do you feel like there is somewhat of an awakening in the United States?
Yeah. I think that individually, God has plan A and plan B. First of all, why did he make us? Everything that he made in the universe follows rules, laws of planetary motion, laws of gravity, laws of physics, laws of optics, laws of pressure. I mean, it's laws. And animals follow instinct. And we're the only beings that he created that can love him back. I mean, I looked up the word angel in the Bible. It appears 289 times. Not one time is the word love used to describe an angel's relationship with God.
Mm.
They worship God. They glorify God. The word angel means messenger. They deliver God's messages. They deliver his judgments, right? They sang when the stars were created. They rejoice when a sinner converts. Jesus said, I'll confess you before the angels. They're mighty beings. They're incredibly intelligent beings, but they were made for a purpose, right? They're not made in God's image, and Jesus did not die on the cross for angels. They were made for a purpose. What purpose were you made for? And me, right? We're not very smart. We're not powerful. Well, guess what? The word love is used all throughout the Bible to describe men and women's relationship with God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Psalms 91, because he set his love upon me, therefore I will deliver him. Jesus rose from the dead and said, Peter, do you love me? Out of all of God's creation, we're the only beings created to love him back. But for love to be loved, it must be voluntary. So he has to create this atmosphere where we have the human experience where we have choice. He actually has to hide himself because he is so powerful and so irresistible, right? Here's our God that created they say now there's a trillion times a trillion stars in the universe. I mean, a being that can create a trillion, if he were to appear to you, your response would be involuntary. You'd be like the Apostle John in the book of Revelation, I fell at his feet as dead. It would be instantaneous. And God's like, I can do involuntary responses all eternity long. Been there, done that. I'm interested in this voluntary love response. So he has to hide himself. People say, if God's real, why doesn't he show himself? Because the moment he shows himself, your free will's gone.
Mm.
Right? And the same hiding of himself that allows us to have free will necessitates that we have faith. So it's a little bit, I wrote about this in a book called Believe. But the bottom line is God made us for fellowship and for love, but love has to be voluntary. And so the idea in the Bible is God blesses you with stuff and then gives you voluntary opportunities to show on the outside the love of God that's on the inside. And it's a voluntary, it's not socialism where the government involuntarily takes away your stuff and gives it to somebody you'll never meet. And they don't care whose paycheck the money came out of.
Right.
And so voluntary versus involuntary is the difference between the early church. And so people say, wasn't the early church socialist? No, the early church was the early church. Socialism is counterfeit early church. And the difference is between the word voluntary and involuntary. So historically, the church has been the one to show God's love. The government can't show love. The government redistributes and takes from somebody that doesn't want it taken away and gives it to somebody that doesn't care where it came from. And guess what? They found out that they can gain votes that way. And so now you have a political motivation for the government to take away the church's role. So we want to help the people to become successful in their own countries, right? Send missionaries, educate them, build hospitals and orphanages and wells in the villages. And then if we can get back to letting the church take care of immigrants and being able to track them and have relationships with them and only bringing them in as fast as they can be assimilated and have the government back off. And then, there's the issue of the minimum wage. But when you look at it, that was what caused outsourcing. You raise the wages in America, the business has to make money. And so what do? They go to a country where there's cheap labor. And then guess what? There's fewer jobs in America.
Yeah.
And so maybe we need to rethink the whole minimum wage argument and come up with a different solution to it.
Right.
But again, prior to the big government, every immigrant was a net plus. Bring them in. They're cheap labor, and they'll work. They have a Christian ethic. They'll work hard. They'll vote for candidates that'll take away as little as possible. And so anyway, I've talked a lot. Hopefully some of this might find
Yes,
useful.
absolutely. It's been a very helpful conversation. We'll end this way. I know we said would talk about your other book, but we've run out of time. So, but just to tie it in a little bit, the reason your Silence Equals Consent book interests me so much is that I have felt like I've seen a lot of pastors or just everyday Christians that are also called to go and make disciples and to speak the truth be very hesitant to speak on this issue or to teach on this issue. And I'm just curious what you might say to encourage churches to step up and speak the truth, even though they're called all these names and they're told it's unloving, to have this truly biblical perspective. I mean, that's what you have shown us here today, is that this is the biblical and the loving perspective. If God is love, the most loving thing we can do is to agree with him. So this is the loving perspective. So can you just maybe give some encouragement to Christians today on why we are actually, not just that we should speak on these things, but that we are actually obligated to speak the truth when it comes to important matters like this?
Right. That if you're silent, you're giving consent to whatever evil's going on. And so when the apostles were hiding out and then they get filled with the Holy Spirit, they couldn't be silent anymore. They had to speak out. They spoke out praising God, but then they went around to change the world. They would go in, populations would become more Christian, but then once they got in an office, they would outlaw slavery, they'd outlaw human sacrifice, they'd outlaw temple prostitutes, right? They would, but the idea is that he said it'll be like yeast; it's going to go everywhere. I can't imagine Jesus saying it's going to go everywhere except not in the government. I mean, what's the government anyway? You have 10 commandments. Half of them deal with your relationship with God. Half of them deal with your relationship with other people. What's government? It deals with your relationship with other people.
Right.
Right? It governs how you're going to do transactions, how you're going to do what you can and cannot do to other people. So basically, to say that Christians can't be involved in government is saying don't look at half the 10 commandments. That it's so we need to have the church be involved, speak up. One of the big things is child sex trafficking. Is it loving to let child sex trafficking continue? I read an article by the Goya, the food company, and he said that the title of the article was that the Biden administration is participating in sex trafficking of children. And he's admitting to it. He goes, because it's a Mexican company, he says that everybody knows whenever the United Nations comes in to do disaster relief and there's refugees, guess what? Child sex trafficking increases. If you have a government structure with no morals and there's a profit motive to sell children, guess what? There are people that are bad that are going to be attracted to that. Is that loving to be quiet and not say anything about it? That children, or hundreds of thousands of them, are being sex trafficked? And then let's go back to the source. The source is these globalists making money in these third world countries and putting out of business their local businesses. Maybe we need to scale back these globalists. Maybe we need to let the money stay in those countries and not go to some global corporation somewhere. Let the money stay within their country and help their country to become prosperous so that people won't want to leave anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for being here with us, Bill. I really appreciate it. This was an awesome conversation. And I just pray that for my audience, this informs you and it equips you. And thank you so much, Bill. Hopefully we'll get to talk again soon. Maybe we can schedule a time to go more in depth to some of your other books. I would really love that.
Yeah. Well, my website's AmericanMinute.com. AmericanMinute.com.
And that's where they can find and order any of your books. Is that correct?
Yes. And the
Okay. Awesome.
one on socialism, the one on silence equals consent, and I even have a whole nother one called There Really Is a Santa Claus, the history of St. Nicholas and Christmas holiday traditions. Anyway.
That's awesome. Yes. Okay, great. Well, you have a good rest of your day, Bill, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Bless you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.